for the invitation to come and speak today. It's my pleasure to be here. This is the title of my talk, Social Networks and Aging, Integrating Structural Perspectives to Understand Well-Being in Later Life. So I basically have, I think it's 5 goals or 5 sort of points that I hope to cover today in the seminar. So this is an overview of where we're going. First of all, some terminology and definitions about social network analysis and how it's related to social gerontology. Secondly, why do networks matter? Why should this be an area worth consideration? Thirdly, I'm going to overview some of the growing interest and some of the fresh, innovative directions of studying network phenomena in social gerontology. Fourth, I'm going to sort of, and this is sort of the focus of where I'll be spending most of my time today talking, is sort of giving an overview of network structure and some of the implications for well-being in later life as sort of an emerging research area in social gerontology and social networks. And then finally, I'll present some original sort of ongoing analysis that a student and I have been working on, specifically on the subject of network density and risk of elder mistreatment, sort of as an exemplar of the fourth point of how network structure might be related to some aspects of well-being in later life. So those are the 5 points I hope to hit, and we'll see if we can do this in about an hour or so. Okay, so some terminology and some definitions. First, I'll just start with giving an overview of what the definition, what the sort of precise definition of a network is as far as social network analysts think of them. A social network is a formal conceptualization of actors or nodes in a larger social network, as defined by the connections between actors. So there's 2 basic parts of that definition, right? There's both actors and ties. Actors are, or nodes, are any kind of unit of analysis that we're interested in, any kind of actor in a system. They could be people, they could be organizations, they could be books or other cultural artifacts, they could be any kind of central unit of analysis that is embedded in this social system. Links are the social relationships or the connections between those actors or between those nodes. So links could be things like friendship, they could be formal relationships by kinship, they could be conflict, they could be social support, they could be any kind of determining relationship that fits between the various actors in the system. So therefore, a network is a set of nodes and the ties that connect those nodes together in a social structure. That's sort of the formal conceptualization of a social network. And sort of provide an illustration, probably the nicest thing about social networks is that they lend themselves quite easily to nice, clear diagrams or nice, clear figures that sort of give you a good intuition of what's actually happening. So this set of data comes from, this is a social network of a retirement community that I studied several years ago from the United States. And these are 123 older men and women that live in this retirement community. Their ages upwards of about 77 up to about 98. And this is all 123 of those actors and the links between them. Now the links here, or the connections between these nodes, are defined as people's reports of talking to others in this community about important matters. So each of these 310 or so links that you see are an indication that one node talks with or reports talking with another node in this community about things that are important to them. So looking at this network, I mean, it provides a lot of interesting information right off the bat that sort of give us a clear idea of what's happening here. We can look at a network like this, and it gives us some kind of indication about why would it be that the relationships form. And right away you can start to generate intuitive ideas about why and how relationships start to form in this particular type of community. For instance, we might see the emergence of certain forms of cliques or factions in this community, and it might give us some indication of the sort of underlying structure of those relationships in this community. We can also, though, look at this and overlay other sort of compositional factors or sort of other traits or features of the actors that might help us make sense of what's happening in this community. So for this particular diagram, it doesn't show up particularly well. I wish that maybe right here that the projection was a little clearer, but you can actually see that there's somewhat darker nodes and somewhat lighter nodes. So the light gray nodes or circles in this diagram are women. The majority of people in this community are women, and about 30 or 40, between 30 and 40% are men, and they are in the slightly darker circles. So you can sort of see some of the clustering that women tend to associate more with women in this facility, the men who are more rare. There's a little bit of clustering by that. Again, it's a little bit hard to see, but that's kind of the dynamic that's happening in this community here. Looking at this sort of entire network structure, we also get a sense of how things like information or something like the flu or a disease could be spread. So you can look at this sort of structure and you can sort of see people right at the middle of the hub of this network would probably be the people, if there was a disease going around, might be the people that would be the most likely to catch the flu first. And then people on the far peripheries, the corners of this network, might be people that would be, getting the flu a little bit later if we believed something about disease transmission in this type of community. But also things like gossip or news might spread according to where people are located in this particular network space. Another sort of concept that's important, a sort of issue that I'll talk a little bit later as the talk goes on, is the issue of how people are connected together in larger clusters, such as triads, so groups of 3 people that are together. So if you look at this sort of circled portion of this network at the very bottom, you see there's, I think, 5 or 6 people that are located there, A through F. And so if we look at actors A, C, and E, actor C is tied to actor A. There's a connection between those people. There's also a connection between actor E and actor A. But there's sort of a missing link or a missing connection, a hole in that network, so to speak, in that triad, between person C and person E. That's what's known as sort of an open triad or an unclosed triad. There's the potential for 3 people to be linked, but really that triangle has an open component to it. There's only connections between A and C and A and E, not between C and E. And you can sort of look across all the various different actors in the network and sort of get a sense of how much triadic openings, how many triadic openings versus how much triadic closure is there across various combinations of those actors in the network. So one way to think about this network is that it's sort of a collection of different potential triads or potential mini-structures that sort of comprise and aggregate up to a bigger structure. And as I'll talk about a little later on, I think there are some structural implications when there are these sorts of closed versus open triads in the system. So a network that has a lot of embeddedness or that there's a lot of overlap between people, this would be a highly clustered unit. You can look at this network right here and see there's a lot of opportunities or openings for more connections than there actually are. Precisely, there's only 310 links between the actors in this system. Potentially, with 123 people, there's a potential, if you look at relationships going both ways, there could be 15,000 or so actual connections there. So the concept of density is a formal sort of definition of how many ties there are in this network versus how many there could be if all of those ties were realized. So this is sort of a nice, sort of clean picture. You can quickly sort of end up in a sort of spaghetti plate of nonsense if you have really, really, really dense networks, right, where everybody is tied to everyone. This one is sparse enough. The density is low enough that it actually allows us to see some patterns and sort of make sense of it. So density is about 2% here. 2% of the total ties exist that could exist. 2 other definitions and sort of just off the bat terms that will be helpful for our discussion is also the distinction between whole networks and what are called egocentric networks. The network that I have here is what's known as a whole network. I'm basically starting with 123 people. They're defined as part of the network because they all live in this community. And I'm basically charting out and showing the internal wiring of all the connections between those people. This is a whole network that's in front of us. The other sort of type of a network that oftentimes is studied in social gerontology is what's referred to as an egocentric network. This is the idea that we can analyze a network from the perspective of the one focal individual. So if we were to, again, take this sort of enclosed circle at the bottom, this group of 6 actors, person A is known as ego here. So this network is sort of shown from the perspective exclusively of that focal individual, person A or ego. And so A, this woman, it's a sort of a light-colored tie, she's tied to, she reports ties to 5 other people, people B, C, D, E, and F. And so we can get a sense of, just starting with this egocentric network, things like the composition of her network. She has 4 women in her network, and one man. She has a total network of size 5. So she reports size of 5 people, 4 of which are women. And there's also a sense in which her egocentric network has its own density. So there is a sense of which actors among her egocentric network are connected to one another. And you can see here, as I already mentioned, there's room for more ties to emerge. There are structural holes in her egocentric network. C and E could become introduced, could start to talk with one another, could develop their own relationship. Person D and F, only connected now through her, could themselves become tied in the future. So the egocentric network, again, we could take this person A, and we could now go through all the other 123 people in this network and comprise their egocentric network. So this person way out here on the very bottom left-hand corner, not tied to anyone else, that person is an isolated person. Poor person, nobody reports talking to them. They report talking to no one else in this community, and so they have this network size of 0. We could go through and sort of comprise this sort of story, this narrative for all the other people in the network. What commonly happens, though, in most research in social gerontology isn't that we have a nice, cleanly defined community of people and comprise the network that way. Oftentimes, in practice, what happens in most research in social gerontology is we conduct some sort of a survey. Maybe it's a representative survey of a population. We go out, sample people, talk to them, ask them then, who are the people that you talk to? Who are the people that are close to you? And comprise some sort of a network based on some kind of connections on the basis of an individual survey report, rather than starting from an actual defined community. So egocentric networks can be defined by a whole community, or they can be defined by individually interviewing separate people. Okay, so that was a quick run through of a lot of terminology, a lot of definitions, and I'll come back to a lot of those core concepts as I go forward from here. But really the important question is, the thing I wanted to hit right off the bat is, why do networks matter? Why should social gerontologists, why should people that care about aging be concerned with social networks? And one of them, this may be the simplest truism about this field, is that networks spread things. Diffusion and influence spreads between people and networks. And this very topic, though it's been studied for a long time, has really sort of captured the public imagination in a really fresh way in really just the last several years, really owing to a couple high-profile studies that got a lot of media attention, that made a big splash. Several studies that were done by a team, a pair of scholars in the U.S., Nicholas Christakis, who's now at Yale, and his colleague James Fowler, a political scientist at the University of San Diego. And the two of them made this big splash. It was profiled in the New York Times Magazine, a little hard to read with the very bubbly font there, but the provocative question asked by the Times several years ago was, are your friends making you fat? And that was essentially, kind of crudely put, that was essentially the point, or the argument, the provocative argument that Christakis and Fowler were trying to make. They claimed that obesity, or who has obesity, can essentially ripple outwards within social networks up to 3 degrees of influence. So that if someone at one point in time is obese, over time we can actually observe not only their friends being at a higher risk of obesity, but their friends. 3 degrees of influence rippling through this social network. And they produce a lot of really nice, sort of fancy social network graphs that look something like this. This comes from their data that was done over 20 years in Massachusetts. The yellow figures in this graph were people that were BMIs above, I think, over 30 or 35. And you sort of see this clustering effect over time, where people in this network tended to look much like their peers in terms of weight status. So there's this provocative argument that they make. They try to initiate a lot of public health sorts of promotions about how we can do things like combat obesity by working on the internal wirings of people's networks. They extended this type of research not only to obesity, but to smoking and smoking cessation, to loneliness, to happiness, and just recently to divorce. And in all of these very different types of phenomena, they argue, there's a social network diffusion effect where your choices, behaviors, features of your environment can ripple outwards to other people that you're connected to. That's the claim. It's been a little bit disputed, especially recently, by several people also working in this area, but it remains somewhat of a splashy set of claims, a splashy set of intriguing findings that we are maybe perhaps connected in really ways that we can't even see intuitively with our own naked eyes. And so they continue to work on this area. Okay, so influence. Networks spread things. The extent to which that happens may be under somewhat debate, but it's clear that networks provide a forum for influence and things to be spread. Secondly, why should this matter for, especially in the aging context? Networks provide access to resources and to social support, things that are really important for older adults. This, again, is an issue that's been studied for a long time. And this is the sort of basic assumption of many social gerontologists that study networks. Networks are conduits. They're the basic infrastructure that allow for the flows of resources and for social support. And the wiring of those networks affects the way that resources get channeled, the way that social support can be coordinated, and controls the flow of those various different types of resources that might be useful for older adults. Here, network composition, or the types of ties that people are connected to, really matters. And this is also an issue that's been studied really for a long time, but there's a lot of important insights that come from it. Different types of network ties provide different types of resources and support, including for those people that are in older age. And a distinction that's often made here when we're talking about access to resources, access to support through social networks, is a fundamental distinction between what are oftentimes called strong ties and weak ties. Strong ties, as their name sort of suggests, are ties that tend to be very close, very intimate, emotionally intimate types of ties, oftentimes long-standing, durable types of ties with a strong sense of reciprocity and mutual obligation to one another through social norms. They tend to be the types of ties that provide intense emotional support, the types of ties that can be called upon in a pinch or a crisis when they're needed to provide some sort of practical or instrumental assistance, maybe to lend money, maybe to help with household issues, maybe to give a ride to the doctor's office and to help navigate paperwork with prescription drugs. Those are the types of things that people oftentimes have in mind with strong ties. Weak ties, as the name implies, are essentially the converse of that. There's not this sort of long-term obligations and reciprocity that might be in place, but weak ties offer some advantages of their own. And so one of the sort of things that weak ties can do that strong ties often can't do is that these weak social ties oftentimes open up bridges, or they connect people to other pools or other sources of social contact, other sources of information or social resources that otherwise wouldn't be accessible through only tightly bonded, close, strong ties. And so weak ties offer these sorts of bridges. They're sort of illustrated in this figure below as these dotted lines, and they sort of take people from outside the close, dense group over to other groups as well. And for older adults, weak ties might be very important in terms of helping people stay connected to their broader community, having a sense of knowledge and access to diversity in their community, providing new sources of information, say about medical treatments or other practical issues of day-to-day life. And so both of these, strong ties and weak ties, sort of play a complementary role in providing people access to needed resources in later life. And finally, maybe the most fundamental or most important aspect of social networks, especially in later life, is that they protect and sustain health. There's very strong, convincing evidence that networks are really, really, really important for helping people stay alive, have good mental health, overcome adversity when they have disabling conditions, have resilience during the face of medical crises. Networks can be very instrumental for protecting and sustaining health. Beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were a set of really path-breaking epidemiological studies that linked people's survival, their life expectancy, to their networks. And people that were the most isolated, people that had the fewest social resources at their disposal, tended to be the people across a variation of different diseases and at different age groups that were at the highest risk of mortality. So a consistent, resounding conclusion seems to be that socially isolated individuals are less able than others to buffer the impact of health stressors and are consequently at greater risk for negative health outcomes. And that has been confirmed again and again and again through a lot of different studies and a lot of different national contexts with different researchers conducting them. And there seems to be a lot of interesting, maybe, reasons for this, which I won't get into now, but there seems to be a lot of interesting both psychological pathways that having social context can do things like reduce people's sense of subjective sense of loneliness, but also enhance their self-esteem, maybe encourage them to maintain good health habits, to see the doctor, encourage them to maintain their regimens of health care. But there also seem to be these even more nuanced physiological pathways where social contacts, access to other people can have things like a calming effect on the cardiovascular reactivity to stress. This can be observed in the laboratory through reactivity types of studies where people are asked to do challenging tasks and then their cardiovascular reactivity is monitored. There seems to be a correlation that people with richer, stronger social networks react better in those circumstances than people that are more isolated. There's also an association with a lot of interesting stress-related biomarkers that's emerging as well. And this is very much an ongoing area of research, but it seems to, again, bear out this fundamental conclusion that social networks matter for helping people stay healthy. So, given the capacity for networks to do these just wide-ranging things, facilitate the diffusion of information or disease, the ability for social networks to yield important social resources, and maybe most fundamentally, the ability for social networks to enhance and support health and well-being. This topic, social networks, has been a foundational concern for gerontologists for a long time, as well as others that are really interested in helping older adults age successfully. And I'm going to point to right now at least 3 recent signs of vitality and fresh direction in the study of social networks and aging. 3 signs that the study of social networks and aging is really, it hasn't sort of reached its uppermost point yet, that it's still cresting, that there's still really fascinating work to be done. One is the sudden availability, sort of fortuitously, that's dumped into our hands of electronic networks. Just this explosion of electronic data that we have at our disposal now that we just didn't have, 10 or even 5 years ago. Online sites such as Facebook are really providing these really cool and innovative, unobtrusive opportunities to gather data, where we don't actually have to go even and interview people and be subject to sort of a lot of the problems that go in with interview data. We can unobtrusively gather a ton of data through electronic means, and even to develop things like intervention studies with helping people be plugged in with Facebook or other online sites like that, helping them with things like photo sharing with friends to help maintain connections. These are really exciting new dynamic opportunities that have only recently become available, and are really sad to say, social gerontologists have been a little slow, maybe on the back end of sort of integrating this sort of electronic network data into their approaches. But there have been really exemplary forms of this type of research that are going on. Just one of these, just for example, is what's known as the Social Networks and Aging Project out of Australia, or SNAP as it's called. It uses digital trace data to understand the networks of older adults. They use a couple of different social networking sites. In Australia, I believe they're also working with Facebook to help integrate this in the Facebook platform as well. And they're linking this online network data to more conventional survey measures of health and well-being to try to find associations, especially longitudinally, between those types of variables. Beyond the sort of really, really cool electronic networks, there's also a lot of innovative techniques for gathering network data in the sort of more old school way as well. And one example comes here from right here at University of Toronto. Paula Gardner, who's affiliated with the U of T, has been doing some really cool, innovative work studying the social networks of adults in the High Park neighborhood of Toronto. She's used this innovative technique, which she calls the go-along method. And that's training a set of researchers, interviewers, really closely among her, with her research group, and then sending them out to sort of drop by and have these sort of informal visits with these older adults living in the High Park neighborhood of Toronto. And these trained interviewers are trained to go and accompany the older adults along their typical outings in a typical day or typical week. So they have repeated visits. They go and just basically tag along with these older adults as they bounce around the different settings that they visit. They go to the coffee shops, the grocery stores, the markets, etc., the parks, and they sort of just observe the sort of natural social interactions that people have throughout the community context. Then they basically follow up and ask people questions as they go along with them, and just sort of have this ongoing, several hour-long conversation about the social networks that emerge in their natural context. And a lot of really interesting findings have started to come out of this type of project that she's initiated. And this type of approach is really useful for uncovering the sort of really broad web of weak ties that exist in people's communities, the types of weak ties that help people feel really connected to the sense of place that they have in their neighborhood, and the types of just small, even incidental encounters that really help bolster people's sense of well-being and their self-esteem, that the fact that they feel socially integrated in their community. So this is another really innovative technique for gathering data. And then thirdly, another sort of sign of vitality in this research area is really the emergence just in the last decade or so of some really high-quality survey data that really use this sort of kind of gold standard approach for measuring social networks, going and conducting interviews with people about their social context. We've had an explosion of a couple really, really wonderful studies that do this really in a truly excellent way. The first was initiated back in 2005 and 2006 by a team out of the University of Chicago in the U.S. called the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, or the NSHAP. And this was a study that was initiated of 4,000 adults or so that were aged 57 to 85 back in 2005. And they have 2 waves now that have been collected, most recently in 2011. And this has recently been called the current gold standard in large-scale survey-based delineation for social network measurement. That's a really high honor for a study specifically tailored to older adults, a social gerontological massive study, sort of to be known as the gold standard throughout the social sciences in terms of measuring social networks. So really cool development there. And this has really been a very instrumental data set for helping uncover a lot of the importance of social networks for older adults. It also includes biological measures, these sort of physiological blood measures as well as a lot of other information about health and sexuality of older adults. Another study that is very similar to the NSHAP, it kind of parallels the design of the NSHAP in a lot of ways, is what's known as the SHARE, or the Survey of Aging, Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe. And this is sort of the European counterpart to NSHAP. It's bigger. It has over 85,000 adults. This is just a phenomenal testament to the coordination of highly skilled research teams across Europe. 85,000 adults aged 50 plus from 19 European nations, plus Israel. It now has 5 waves from 2004 to 2012. And again, the topic of social networks is a really core interest for those researchers. It's really at the heart of what SHARE is doing. So along with data on economics, health, and healthcare, social networks are right at the core of what they're doing in that project. So these 2 excellent survey data sets have really helped spearhead a lot of the new research that's been happening in social networks, research in social gerontology. So, basically, in part, from the really excellent contributions, especially of NSHAP, the first study that I mentioned, and that most of the rest of this talk will be based on, this study out of the U.S. There's been an increasing sort of interest in how network structure, the structure of people's social networks, the way that that's an important property of social connectedness for older adults. So rather than just sort of basically staying at this sort of social isolation versus non-isolation, or the fact that people may or may not have social support in their networks, which are important questions, increasingly there's been a lot of really interesting, nuanced, sophisticated work that sort of gets at some really cool aspects of social network structure itself, or the connection between the different actors in people's networks that have really kind of, in some ways, unexpected implications for social well-being and for health. And so I'm going to give 3 very disparate indicators of well-being in later life that seem to have some connection to this issue of social network structure. And you'll see these are very, very, very disparate types of indicators of social well-being or health and well-being in later life. Receipt of social support, erectile dysfunction among men, elder mistreatment. The latter of which is the subject that I'll sort of finish the talk on and provide some of my own sort of recent analysis that looks at this topic. But these are 3 very, very, very disparate types of indicators of well-being in later life. But each of them seems to have some connection to this really interesting topic of network structure. So let's take the first, receipt of social support. Just as a quick overview of social support, specifically in the context of partnership and spouses in later life. For a long time, it's been known that marital relationships, partners, spousal partnerships are often crucial sources of both instrumental and emotional support in later life. They're important for companionship, for being confidants. They're also important for instrumental things like just helping coordinate visits to the doctor, help with tasks around the home. Clearly they're important for both of those types of issues. But the interesting insight, when you start to take a more scaled back and structural approach to thinking about how networks are involved in people's lives, social support isn't only facilitated, by the role obligations entailed by a spousal partnership, or by the fact that spouses, partners tend to be in very close physical proximity, living in the same household. Spousal support seems also to be enabled by the topic of network overlap, or the sharing of network members between partners. In other words, the fact that spouses or partners tend to be enmeshed or embedded in overlapping social networks, and there tends to be some sort of a network closure that happens, an embeddedness of the various actors throughout their two networks. So a recent study just published last year, or 2 years ago, it's called Spousal Network Overlap as a Basis for Social Support. And you can see this figure at the bottom sort of shows two hypothetical scenarios with ego, or a focal individual person, and his or her spouse, sort of shown in the left corner. You see the spousal node as that circle down there on the left. The first scenario is one in which ego and spouse are connected, obviously. They're partners, so they're connected. But in the first scenario, the spouse is well integrated into ego's network. He or she is connected, has a social relationship with each of those people that ego is connected to. There's a lot of network overlap happening there. The panel on the right, though, the sort of other hypothetical scenario is exactly the opposite, right? So spouse and ego are connected. Ego is obviously connected to his or her own confidants or his or her own social nodes, but the spouse doesn't have a relationship with them. He or she is essentially disconnected or cut off from those types of social relationships. So the hypothesis of network overlap as being a basis of spousal social support would suggest that in the former circumstance, where there's a lot of integration and shared overlap, those would be the circumstances where the spouse would be enabled to provide really optimal social support. There'd be a lot of coordination between the different actors in terms of sharing information, sharing oversight of that person if there was a problem, if they needed to somehow coordinate rides to the doctor, coordinate schedules to help ego in times of need. They'd be much better able to do that than in the latter circumstance, where they're basically those two worlds are essentially cut off from one another. And that's in fact the findings that emerged from this study. The hypothesis was supported that people's level of social support that they receive from their spouse are enhanced or facilitated when the spouse has more contact with ego's own social confidants or social ties. So this just shows the probabilities of receiving the highest levels of 3 different forms of social support from a spouse, discussing health with the spouse, relying on the spouse, or being able to feel like they can open up to a spouse. In all circumstances, the probability of each of those types of support is lowest when the spouse, on average, never has contact with the ego's social ties, but it's highest on the far right-hand side of that x-axis when the contact is on average daily. So when the spouse has daily high levels of contact, they also provide the highest levels of social support. There could also be some other confounding factors playing into that, but the argument here is that, at least that the authors try to convey, is that spousal support is somewhat of a function of broader network structure in which those two people are embedded. Okay, to take an even more maybe unexpected or maybe less apparent or less intuitive type of outcome of well-being, let's take the example of erectile dysfunction among men and ask, does that have some kind of connection to network structure in which people are embedded? This comes from another recent study that was just done several years ago called Network Position and Sexual Dysfunction, Implication of Partner Betweenness for Men. Let's start with this sort of just a really basic statement that if you look at triads. If you look at a spouse, a male spouse, his partner, and another confidant that he has, or another close social tie that that man has, there's a variety of different possible triadic configurations that could represent those three actors. This figure from this recent article shows 5 different possible triadic configurations or structural configurations that those 3 people could be found in. It could be the case if we look at this. Let's take, for instance, this situation here. This figure is representing dark lines representing frequent contact between those actors, and the dotted lines represent relatively infrequent forms of contact between those actors. So this second panel there, where we see the triad confidant, ego, and partner, here the ego, this focal individual man, and his partner, because they're partners, they have a lot of contact, relatively frequent contact. The ego, that man, also has relatively strong levels of contact with his other confidant or his other tie, and his partner has relative to him, relatively infrequent contact. So in other words, he has more contact with his friend than his spouse has with his friend. And that might be it might be a relatively frequent type of triadic configuration. It might be the kind of thing we'd expect. The third picture here is where the ego and partner, the male and his partner, are very strongly tied to one another, and each of them also has relatively weaker ties to that other confidant. They're both more strongly tied to each other than they have contact with the third person. This fourth position here is that all 3 of them are highly tied. So the man, his partner, and that third tie, they're all tightly bounded together. They all have high levels of contact. But the fourth case is maybe the most interesting one. It might be the most interesting or unexpected type of triadic configuration. This is what the authors of the study called partner betweenness. This is the case where the male and his partner are strongly tied to one another, but the partner has a stronger tie to his own friendship that he identifies than he does. So relative to him, his partner sees his own friend more than he reports seeing that friend. And so literally the partner is in some ways between, in some senses, the man and his own friend or his own confidant. And the authors refer to this as a sense of partner betweenness, as a sort of unexpected or relatively uncommon type of triadic configuration, but maybe a type of triadic configuration that could have some implications for that older man. So partner betweenness, the authors argue, could signify several things. Potentially it could signify an older man in ill health, he relies on his spouse to facilitate social contacts. He relies on going between his spouse to his own friends. It could be that the man himself is not well integrated with other people and he relies entirely on the spouse to provide his social contact. Or maybe most nefariously, the spouse could be some kind of a domineering gatekeeper for all his social contact, and he has to seek the permission or approval from his wife or partner before he's actually able to get access to those social contacts. Again, these are implications that are thought of by these authors. I'm not endorsing any one of those 3, but all of them are sort of potential scenarios of how this triadic configuration could look. And what are the implications of partner betweenness? It sort of implies that there could be a lack of autonomy for that man. It could be that he has sort of less unique control over the social resources, and he sort of shares in some ways that with his partner, and he's dependent upon his partner in some ways. It could be that there's a lack of privacy, that if he wants someone to confide in about his partner, that he really doesn't have a lot of access to that sort of a social connection outside of his partner, and any news that he shares with that other friend might get back to the partner. And most fundamentally, according to these authors, in some sense, in feminist theory, it sort of undermines some of the traditional aspects of masculinity, the ideas of men having control over their social resources, being autonomous, having control over their immediate surroundings. And the authors attempt then, they hypothesize that maybe this sense of partner betweenness might be associated with risk of erectile dysfunction, a condition that's known to have a lot of psychogenic sort of origins, the idea that erectile dysfunction in many ways has as much to do with psychological factors or relational factors as it does with sort of ontogenic or physiological realities. And so in fact what they find in this study is they actually find that men that demonstrate this pattern of partner betweenness are actually at 3 different age groups, 57 to 64, 65 to 74, and 75 plus. At each of those 3 age groups, but most pronounced especially at the lower end, those men are indeed at higher risk of erectile dysfunction, or at least reporting erectile dysfunction. So again, a very interesting, innovative way to think about network structure is maybe having some sort of implications for men's well-being. So again, a really fascinating study. Just another illustration of the way thinking structurally about networks can help us maybe find out something interesting or unexpected about well-being in later life. And so finally, the sort of third topic that I'll talk about, and this is sort of the main empirical research that I'll present today, is on network structure and elder mistreatment specifically, the risk of elder mistreatment in later life. To sort of give you just a really brief background on elder mistreatment, I'm going to rely on this definition that was articulated by the National Research Council of the National Academies about a decade ago. This is commonly used in the literature of elder mistreatment, and the definition goes like this, that elder mistreatment are the intentional actions that cause harm or create serious risk of harm, whether or not the harm is intended, to a vulnerable elder by a caregiver or another person who stands in a trust relationship to the elder, or by failure by a caregiver to satisfy the elder's basic needs or to protect the elder from harm. So a very broad, sort of encompassing definition of elder mistreatment. There's been a lot of discussion about how to best operationalize this concept, but this is the sort of very broad definition that I'll be working with as I talk today. Research that reviews of the literature in this area have really found a wide range of different prevalence estimates for elder mistreatment across different national contexts, across different samples. Some reports fall between 3% and 27.5%, so a really broad range of different estimates of how widespread this social problem of elder mistreatment is. And a lot of that has to do with the way that questions are asked, the types of samples that are being studied in a national context, or whether these are samples that are derived from institutions like long-term care homes. A lot of that accounts for these wide-ranging differences, or even definitions of elder mistreatment. And then finally, another just overall background point about elder mistreatment is that there have been many risk factors that have been identified. Some of the main ones include cognitive impairment and dementia, physical and mental health problems. These are probably oftentimes also consequences of elder mistreatment, but they also appear to be unique risk factors as well. People in worse health, people in the worst mental health, as well as people with cognitive impairment seem to be at much higher risk of experiencing elder mistreatment. So that is a very brief background on the social problem. How is it that social network density in later life might be related in some way to the risk of elder mistreatment? The theoretical perspective and the sort of idea that informs the main hypothesis from this work starts from this question: is network density associated with risk of maltreatment? And the theoretical sort of work, or the theoretical background, comes from sociologist James Coleman, a really influential sociologist who wrote a lot in the 1980s about theories of social capital. And the basic idea that Coleman introduced was that social closure, when you have a group of different actors, social closure, or the existence of ties within a network, provides welfare, provides well-being for the actors involved, and ultimately providing what he calls social capital. And the three main arguments are these, is that when you have, say, a condition of, you take this triad here at the bottom of the screen, if there was to be a tie between those two unconnected actors, if there was, in other words, social closure where there are structural holes right now, it would allow for information to be more accessible between all three of those people. They could better spread information in the circumstance of social closure rather than structural holes. Social closure, or a tie that would extend between those two unconnected ties, would better enable the three people together to protect norms, to have a shared sense of normative obligations, and to enforce sanctions. So if one of those three people was misbehaving, the other two could in fact enforce sanctions, swiftly address the problem, and enforce the norms that were there. And finally, patterns of social closure reinforce mutual obligations, where you have patterns, whether it's a community or whether it's a simple three-person unit like this, when you have more closure, more connections between the people, there's a stronger sense of people having mutual obligation to one another, to having some sort of reciprocity for the group, to having some sense of upholding what the group believes in or espouses. And so the idea is, the theoretical idea is that when that tie is closed, all these conditions increase. Information gets spread more easily, sanctions can be more enforced, and people have a stronger sense of mutual obligation to one another. Well, how does that theoretical background relate to this issue of social network structure? The idea is this, is that social network structures with high levels of closure, and going back, the beginning of the talk, that means, in other words, denser networks where there are more realized ties rather than open or non-existing ties between actors. So networks where there is a high level of social closure or density should be the optimal sorts of configurations, structurally speaking, for detecting instances of mistreatment, for detecting or observing instances where bad behavior, controlling behavior, ill-intentioned behavior might be taking place, and it should be the ideal conditions as well for sanctioning perpetrators, for the people observing that bad behavior to mount a united front and to swiftly address the problems that are happening. These should be the ideal conditions, structurally speaking, for helping to deter elder mistreatment. So conditions where those things are met would be the conditions where people, potential perpetrators, would have the less leeway to mistreat older individuals. So the hypothesis is this, is that distinct from the size of the network density is associated with a lower risk of elder mistreatment. That's the working hypothesis for this project. And so to test this empirically, we take data from the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, or the NSHAP, which I mentioned before, which has these really excellent measures of social networks, people's core important networks, as well as the connections between those ties in their networks. Again, it's a nationally representative. We're using a study. We're using 3,000 U.S. older adults that were initially interviewed. There's a high response rate for this data set, or for this survey. And it links self-reports of mistreatment to social network data. And as far as I know, this is the only representative data set out there that actually is able to unite these two things together, both social network data as well as self-reports of elder mistreatment. Okay. So it's in some ways a unique data source for examining the hypothesis. In terms of measurement, elder mistreatment was assessed in the NSHAP by a series of questions, or 4 indicators, that were developed directly in consultation with the National Research Council's report that I mentioned the definition of a couple slides ago. So this refers to whether people have experienced each of the 4 different types of experiences in the past year. So the NSHAP respondents were asked if anyone was too controlling over the daily decisions of their lives, whether someone verbally insults them or puts them down, whether someone dispossesses them of money or belongings without their permission, and then finally whether there are any instances of physical abuse, hitting, kicking, slapping, pushing, or having things thrown at them. So these were the 4 sort of domains that were assessed on the survey. And this table shows some descriptive statistics from those 4 different measures. The most common form of mistreatment as assessed by the survey was people being verbally mistreated, being called names or being insulted. About 14.5% of the NSHAP respondents reported that experience in the last year. The least common was being hit or physically assaulted. Less than 0.5%, only 12 people out of the 3,000 or so reported experiencing that. But then if we look at sort of any indications, if we take sort of the broadest brushstroke whatsoever in terms of any form of mistreatment, about a quarter of the people, 23.5% or so, reported any of those forms of mistreatment in the past year. Then if we count them up, on average, the average respondent reported about 0.3 forms of mistreatment, ranging from 0 to 4 forms of mistreatment. We have data again from the social networks, and the way that this was actually measured in the NSHAP was this. There were actually 3 network rosters of close social ties that were assessed in this survey. They began the survey, or the outset, by asking people, from time to time, most people talk with others in their lives about things that are important to them. This could be sharing good news or bad news, or just sharing other types of information. Who are the people that you would talk to about things that are important to you? And people have the opportunity then to identify by name or initial 1 to 5 specific names of people. Then they were asked if they had a spouse or romantic partner. If those people hadn't been identified at first, they were then added an additional network roster. And then finally, after those names were added, they were finally asked, is there anyone else that comes to mind that's especially close to you that you didn't already name? And so that person was also added to this overall network roster. And this gives us a total network size of 0 to 7 people. People could name up to 7 people as being part of this core social network. We also develop other indicators from that social network data. We look at what proportion of kin members or family members comprise their social network, what proportion of that network lives within their household, how close on average they felt to each of those social network members, how much interaction they had on average with each of their social network members, whether they interacted with them daily or more than daily, all the way to yearly. And the core measure that we're using is this measure of social network density. And that's the total number of ties that exist between the ties themselves within that network. And this was defined by whether or not each of their ties interacted at least once a year with each of the other ties in the network. And sort of give you a visual depiction of what this looks like as a bit of intuition. This shows two illustrations of network density. The first would be a network density of 0.42. This would be 9 potential ties between alter to alter, or ties between ties. Those orange people being the alters, or being the ties of egos in the middle, his or her ties. So here we have potentially 21 ties between ties existing for a network of size 7. In this case, there's only 9 actually existing, so 9 divided by 21 gives us a density score of 0.42. This was about a standard deviation below the average in this data set. The average, or the mean density that we find by doing this calculation, is a density of 0.71. And this would be basically 15 out of 21 alter ties, or ties between the ties, for network size 7. And so you can immediately see a much denser structure on the right, a much looser, more sparse network structure on the left, 0.42 versus 0.71. We also include a number of additional factors that have been studied in the past as risk factors for risk of elder mistreatment. There were a number of other ones not shown here, such as household size, that were also explored and didn't really change the findings. But these are the ones that I'll actually show today, other sort of covariates in our analyses. And this presents just a bunch of numbers. These are regression estimates of how the association between network density and either any mistreatment reported in the last year, as well as a count of mistreatment events that were reported in the past year, and also controlling for individual characteristics such as those health-related factors, cognitive impairment, physical health, physical limitations, race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. This isn't very intuitive to look at. These are regression estimates from logistic regression and from negative binomial regression. What I'll show you is a sort of more intuitive graphical depiction of how this would play out. So what those estimates on that past table suggest is that if you go from that relatively loose network, density 0.42, holding everything else constant, or everything else held at its mean in that equation, if you were then to look at a fully dense network where there were 21 out of 21 ties existing, density of 1, this would decrease, on average, this would decrease the risk of reporting mistreatment by about 6%. It would lower the odds, and it would also basically mean a 6% lower probability of reporting mistreatment. So the probability calculated from those regressions in the previous slide was that with a relatively sparse network, density 0.42, below standard deviation below the mean, would be a probability of about 0.26 of someone reporting elder mistreatment, but that probability would be only about 0.2 for someone that was in a maximally close maximally dense social network, everything else held equal. And I should mention that this sort of 6% decrease in probability is about the same as going from the 75th percentile of depression to the 25th percentile of depression, or about similar in scope to going from no physical disabilities to the 90th percentile of physical disabilities. So although a 6% decrease in the probability, not astounding, it's not monstrous, but it has a relatively strong level of association comparable to some of these other known risk factors for elder mistreatment. So, knowing that there is this sort of this association between network density and the risk of reporting elder mistreatment, we followed up with a couple auxiliary types of research questions to try to flesh out a little bit more what might be going on here. So one thing we asked is, how often are the perpetrators of mistreatment themselves located within the respondents' core networks? So in that roster of 7 people to which the ego was felt close to, or the important people in their lives, how often was it that the perpetrators of being hit, verbally insulted, and so on, how often did that actually occur within the network itself? One of the clever aspects of this survey in NCHAP was it actually allows us to sort of link those things together, both reports of mistreatment to the network. And then we followed up and asked, are the perpetrators, if there were perpetrators within the network, how embedded were those perpetrators in the network among other people? Do they tend to be people that were relatively on the margins of the network, sort of lurking on the margins, people that could be sort of out of detection from the others in the network, or were they people that were actually relatively embedded themselves in the network? These data quickly show the sort of role of, or how often the perpetrators of mistreatment actually appear within the social networks themselves. And we actually find that in 61% of the cases when the person reported that their network alter or their network tie was very controlling of them, 61% of the times that person that was the controller actually was in the network itself. And that sort of makes some intuitive sense, right? If someone's being very controlling over a person's life, it makes sense that they would probably be well positioned to do that if they were within the network itself, knowing the other people that were important in the ego's lives. Other forms of mistreatment, not as common, but in each of those cases, it's above 20% in each of those cases where the person perpetrating was also a network member themselves. So what we did finally to sort of follow up and to finish up our analysis, we asked this question, are those perpetrators less embedded in the network than are the other ties? So here's basically, pictorially, here's what we're doing in this analysis. We're basically asking, taking each of the alters, or each of those close people within ego's network, ego being R for respondent, and I'm highlighting the sort of the brightened orange person is the network tie that we're focusing on. We're asking, what proportion of the other ties within that network is that highlight yellow or orange tie connected to? In other words, is that alter on the left side connected to a high proportion of other ties in the network, or is he or she not very well connected to most of the other ties within the network? Does the reported mistreatment by a tie, does the fact that that orange tie mistreat R, or the ego, does that predict higher or lower levels of integration within the network? And so we control for a variety of different alter level variables that correspond with that alter, or that orange tie, the most important being whether or not they do each of those 4 types of mistreatment, as well as a couple other controls. And we also control for aspects of the respondent level variables themselves. So again, a lot of the same variables that I just talked about a couple slides ago. And the results from this analysis suggest that ties who control or who hit R, so whether or not this tie reports or is reported to have hit or to have controlled ego here, this respondent, that's actually related to that ego being relatively more embedded in the network, or having a higher proportion of other ties that this person is connected to. There was no association that we were able to find between dispossessing the respondent or calling the respondent names, however, and this person being tied to these other people in the network. Okay. So basically what that shows is there's not reason to suggest that if this person in the network is someone that's mistreating the respondent, that somehow they're disconnected from everybody else, that they're lurking undetected at the margins of the network. Seems to be that they're actually relatively well embedded with the other people in the networks. But that it's not necessarily just a dyadic phenomenon, it's actually something about the overall structure of the network that actually can inhibit or potentially protect against forms of mistreatment happening in this network. So to wrap up, as consistent with the hypothesis that I posed a few minutes ago, we do find that older adults with very relatively dense networks had a lower risk of reporting elder mistreatment across different forms of elder mistreatment. Interestingly, however, the perpetrators of those harmful acts were often found within the core or close networks of the seniors themselves, though we've had little evidence to suggest that the perpetrators were poorly embedded in the networks. So it seems sort of a paradoxical finding here that the people that perpetrate oftentimes are in the networks. When they are in the networks, they're not really poorly embedded with the others, but at the same time, the network as a global structure, as a structural phenomenon in of itself, seems to have some protective influence on risk of elder mistreatment. So we think that the results highlight in some ways how network level phenomena can operate distinctively from dyadic mistreatment processes. In other words, dense personal networks seem to provide some of the best structural arrangements for protecting against elder mistreatment, even as many of the offensive acts are committed by the people that are close to a victim and relatively well embedded in the network, or at least not poorly embedded in the network at all. Okay, so I would just, in closing, just a couple of acknowledgments. John Coltai, a PhD student in our department, has been instrumental with working with me on this density and maltreatment research. We'd also like to thank Shirk for the support, and the NSHAP data were provided by the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Science Research at the University of Michigan, and they don't stand by the findings, they just make the data available. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you because that was really a very distinctive way of reinforcing the idea that people need people and that we need to be connected and we need to be together. I just want to, and certainly in terms of health, perpetuating health, transferring knowledge, and all of these aspects, I just want to skip ahead to your elder abuse. And much of what you say from that large data could be also emphasized from different data where you would find out who abuses, and mostly it is family members who abuse, so they are in close contact, and it could be your mate or it could be anywhere like that. Your data goes up to age 85, but we know now we're living longer, and as you get older you're more isolated, and that is removing the networks. And we also know that language, as you said, and ethnicity, and all these factors that inhibit making those networks. So what I would love to know is for your next research, what you would do to deal with some of these elder abuse now that you know of, I mean, you knew it anyway intuitively, but now that you are able to prove it and show it, how you can deal with people who are isolated, who are afraid of their caregivers, who have great fear of being separated and being in a worse situation if they report their caregivers. And by the way, in most of the Canadian data, it says that the most self-reported elder abuse is financial, because that's not dealing with a caregiver and that's not jeopardizing how you are cared for, not verbal abuse or things like that. So where can we go with that data? That's my
Yeah, thank you for that question and comments. Those are really, really helpful comments. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of limitations specifically to this data. We're using, we think is really high quality data, and it in some ways constrains the types of questions that we can ask and the type of things we can do. The thing that's really left out of this is these are all community dwelling adults. These are not people living in institutional settings, and we know that there's a lot of, you know, especially in those types of settings, a lot of mistreatment that happens, and we're completely blind to that in these types of data. And so I think that's a critical area to address as well, especially people that are the most vulnerable, that have the least, the lowest levels of autonomy and independence, especially, are left out of this whole story. I think the sort of, maybe the sort of practical, if there were to be some sort of practical steps or things that this illustrates and maybe give us new knowledge of how to work with things, is that to realize, structurally speaking, there's strength in density. So in other words, if we have a case where there's, people might be at risk of being mistreated by a spouse or be some other caregiver, do the neighbors who know the person, the older adult, do they know those caregivers? Is there some way that there's a connection there that they can check in on and in some ways hold accountable those other people that might be the ones doing the mistreatment? So I guess, in other words, especially for vulnerable older adults, we need to find ways to reinforce a massive multiplexity of these different ties so that there are dense webs going on rather than sparseness in the network. So I think that actually could have a lot of there could be a lot of really concrete types of interventions or implications for that type of an insight, I think.
Because very small percentages are actually institutionalized.
Yeah.
Most of the seniors are in their homes.
That's right.
In the community.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have a case right now that we're dealing with, and this is a situation. The client is a 96-year-old lady in a retirement home who needs to be in long-term care. The sister is 92. She's blind, and the neighbors have taken her on to the extent that they are controlling her life. And she, with a gentleman who employed us, have the power of attorney for personal care for the 96-year-old lady. CCAC went in to get signatures to put her into long-term care, and the 92-year-old sister will not do so because her neighbors have advised her not to. Today, at 10 o'clock, I went with the gentleman who's 82 himself and has known his family for 40 years, and the neighbor's mother was there, and she said, "You didn't report that you were coming today, so you can't get in here." And I said, "Do you know what the word elder abuse is all about? Because we're going to deal with this from a legal point of view." It happens.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really compelling story.
It's driving me crazy.
Yeah, it's on the back.
Hi, my name is Bee. I'm a doctor studying health economics.
Hi.
I have a question on the conclusion. When you say that as networks increase, the elders are less abused, but shouldn't it be reporting less abuse because there's no nuance? And if it's reporting, why are they reporting less abuse? If the network gets more dense, are they assuming that the network already know about it, that they don't have to?
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, could it be that maybe some people are more or less likely to report being abused, depending on the structure of their network? So in other words, if they know that they're in a really structured network, a very dense network, they might be afraid of word getting out, right? And there being some sort of reprimanding or maybe negative blowback that could happen if they can report that. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I think that speaks to really the limitations of these sorts of observational data, where there is potentially this sort of endogeneity or this sort of reverse causation that's actually happening here. So again, yeah, we have to assume, I guess, these conclusions do assume that there is no bias in terms of people being willing to report elder mistreatment and not maybe conceal it to save face, or not maybe conceal it in order to, because they're afraid of what would happen if people find out that they are tattling or telling or reporting what's really happening on these other people. So you're absolutely right. It's tough to deal with, I think, in terms of how do we rely on people's self-reported ratings of things like elder mistreatment. We have no secondary verification that these things happened, and there could be a lot of other dynamics happening in these relationships that we're really blind to. So I think you're right. Yeah, I think that is a good voice of caution in terms of interpreting the conclusions. Point well taken. Yeah.
It's really interesting and really innovative research, so thanks for presenting it. I wonder what your thoughts are. Like, the comments have sort of suggested that it'd be interesting to follow up with some qualitative research, and I wonder what your thoughts are. It seems like your research is more quantitative, and in its methods. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Have you considered, getting anecdotal or more qualitative?
Yeah, qualitative research needs to be done in this area, and I think the problem is maybe that there's sort of two really distinct worlds going on here. There's two people that are really excited about this new opportunity to sort of describe, in population terms, what's happening, whether it's in the European context or the U.S., and I'm really hoping that we'll get really, really strong comparable data here in Canada, because we do need to know these sort of population patterns. But then, knowing what's going on, knowing those dynamics, we really, really, really do need good, careful, qualitative research. There's been some qualitative research that I'm aware of, more in the domestic victimization literature, that, again, not specifically elder mistreatment, but mistreatment that's happening much earlier in the life course, that does hint at a lot of these dynamics. And I should mention that the hypotheses that we're testing really emerge in a large way out of a lot of the foundational research in the domestic victimization literature. So I think there needs to be maybe, again, this elder mistreatment really isn't even my core area of research. I was actually hoping to hear some good critiques and comments and pushback from people in this audience who I understand much more well-versed in that research area. But I think you're absolutely right. We do need qualitative inquiry to sort of map on to a lot of these population level data that we have. Yeah, in the back.
Is there any evidence to suggest that personality variables mediate the relation between social network size and well-being outcomes? For example, if someone is highly introverted, maybe does that change the relation between the size of their network and their well-being?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably very reasonable to suspect. Yeah, I mean, personality traits such as openness to experience or extroversion. I mean, I would assume that those types of things would be related very much to social network dynamics. There's some research that's beginning to sort of look into that. What neuroticism might be another really relevant personality characteristic that's related to maybe both of these things, where the risk of potentially to risk of abuse, potentially to social network size. So I think, yeah, that's an area of research that I would be very happy to see. I'd be very happy to see that happen. I'm not aware of anything directly linking those types of variables in this context, but it's an interesting proposition for sure. Yeah.
In your presentation, I saw the word social capital. Does that mean anything? Is that a phrase?
It's a phrase I tried to stay away from as much as possible because it's a very debated and some ways vague term across different fields. It's a phrase that's bandied about and used quite a lot by different researchers, oftentimes talking by or above or between each other and not really at each other. And so I did use it specifically in the context of one theory by James Coleman, who developed a theory of social closure as being a form specifically of social capital. Meaning that where there are existing ties, where there could be holes, that enforces norms, it reinforces mutual obligations and the like. And that's one particular sort of way of using the term social capital. But I will acknowledge many people use social capital in a lot of other very different contexts or different forms. And so I was trying to stay away from that concept as much as possible. But it's a concept that's related very much to social networks. If that makes it, I probably made things a little bit
What would be the other phrase that would be equivalent to social capital?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of different phrases that get used in a lot of different ways. It's different phrases. Social capital is a term that gets used sometimes as being reflective of people's social networks. Social integration is another term that's frequently used here. Social connectedness is another sort of way of conceptualizing the ties between people. Yeah.
The point that was made that the denser that the social network can be, that very often the perpetrators within that group, does that sort of lead to the possibility that it might be wise to not only have those dense social networks, but ego have connections external to that group, i.e. social services such as day programs, religious communities, social networks that might not be personal as such, but are regular.
Yeah.
So that if you do have a sense that your group that the perpetrators within your group, you might have some resistance to complain to anybody within that group in case of ostracization, but you do have somewhere to go.
Yeah, that's a...
Maybe there's something that perhaps with domestic violence, shelters, etc., will provide that role, but there doesn't seem to be specifically towards mistreatment an elder equivalent.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a phenomenal point. I was going to say that I think something that came to mind as you were talking is that there's a dark side to so-called social capital. When you have dense groups where everyone can share information, they can also conceal information and can conceal conspiracies. There could be cases where people are mistreating people within this dense, tightly bonded network, and they don't want things to leak out. That might especially be the case in relatively small, dense networks, where if you have more and more people, you might increase the probability that there'd be a whistleblower and someone would bring it to light. But you're right. What I think it testifies to is that density it can be very good, but there also need to be other connections outside of the group as well. Some sort of a mix between maybe formal organizational ties, other weak ties to others, as well as, again, assuming that those people in the dense network are looking out for one's own good and enforcing good norms rather than bad norms. I think both could be complemented.
The other point would be towards, as you age, you're invested a lot more with those groups because you've had years of connection very often. So there could be a resistance to break them because of a fear of ostracization. If it was a very small group, I mean, if you've known them for 20, 30 years and you risk upending that group, you may be prepared to put up with what you shouldn't be putting up with in order not to lose that and possibly, become lonelier than you are within the group.
Very well said. Yeah, that's a terrific point.
In one of our online viewers has a question, and it's very similar. It's she asked it when you were first describing the health of social networks, the advantages to well-being, and she says it's great if you have good friends in your life, but what if the only people you are connected to aggravate you or cause you stress? Is it better to have someone than no one?
Yeah, and that's one of the other things that I think is really important to mention is that there's sort of been a sort of positive bias of social ties are good, social ties are healthy, and so on. But social ties can also transmit very bad things, right? They can also be a source of stress. And so there's kind of a growing awareness that we need to study negative ties as much as all alongside positive ties. So sometimes one of the critiques I think is well put for a lot of social gerontologies. We're often so concerned with social support that we forget to think about the sort of dark side of social relationships. That there are many relationships that are not even now necessarily outright hostile, but at least ambiguous, maybe at best, where they're
quality of ties.
Yeah, they can be too controlling, or they can have some negative qualities as well. And so there's a lot of ambivalence, I think, that's not well captured in a lot of research. And people are beginning to sort of be aware of, we need to study negative interactions in networks. And that's probably another area that needs to really grow quite a bit. Yeah.
Markus, thank you very much for your talk. There's a lot in this. And I was just to riff off that question, the previous question, your response to it. It seems to me that some of the questions that were asked of the elders in your study, the specific types of abuse they were, it strikes me that there's enough ambiguity in some of those. Obviously, name calling and hitting are very clear calls, but you get into some really subjective issues when you talk about issues of control. What specifically are you talking about? What is understood by that of the parties that are? So if I'm 95 and someone has taken my car keys because they don't want me to drive, I can perceive that as an abuse. While someone else who's well-intentioned may see that as caring. And so there are some very dicey issues that seem to be that are conflated in the same topic as maltreatment.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in some ways the bias towards making an expansive view of maltreatment has been a needed corrective in saying it's not just hitting, right? There are ways that people are mistreated besides showing obvious signs of bruises or chipped teeth. But you're right, once you start making a more expansive definition of maltreatment and allowing for the inclusion of control, that is ethically, empirically, it's very
Yeah, and then there's
challenging.
also, there's a question of what control looks like through the life course. Because control of an individual in their 20s and 30s can have some, so what I wonder is that emergent new behaviors on the part of these actors, or are these long-standing, established behaviors that were in the part of the relationship on a long-term basis?
Yeah.
And again, those are questions that need to be teased out a little bit.
There are. Yeah, very good point. And I will say that probably the most frustrating thing for me as someone that's involved with using this particular data set to sort of ground it in this empirical example that I have. This is a two-wave data set. They followed people up over 5 years. And for time considerations, they decided to excise some of the sections of the survey. And what section did they leave out in the second wave? Unfortunately, it was the maltreatment items. It would have been phenomenal to look at incident experiences, people that didn't report any, and to see whether they reported for the first time these types of mistreatment. And that is an opportunity that will go wanting, unfortunately. So, yeah, you're right, though. It does deserve a lot more careful inspection. Yeah.
Is there any sense in the literature of rate or percentage of older adults who may be misreporting elder abuse because of cognitive impairments or other such health issues?
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of that. I'm sure maybe someone here has a better handle on that. I am aware that cognitive impairment is related to reports of elder mistreatment. That's why we made sure to adjust for that in our estimates that we had. But I'm not aware of any research on misreporting. Institutional settings. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question.
There's a movement in Ontario for the government to encourage people to stay home rather than move into seniors' residences and so on. A lot of my friends have been losing spouses, including myself, in this period. So there are increasing number of women who are actually living alone. And the issues of networking, particularly people have been very embedded with their spouse. I see people not having skills to form new relationships or being resistant to that, and thinking that the isolation is going to be part of and the subject to abuse of if caregivers come in who are not so engaged or not monitored by a wider circle of friends. This could give a whole new level to this.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, I had shown these interesting findings from this other study using, again, the same data set that I was using, the NSHAP, on spousal network overlap as a basis of social support. And so here you can sort of see maybe it cuts on both sides, right? It might be a two-edged sword where it's wonderful to have spousal overlap in terms of providing good social support for a time, but there may come a point in time when when that spouse leaves or dies, when there's actually, it really takes the bottom out from underneath a lot of those support opportunities and can actually create somewhat of a danger situation. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. Hard to find answers to that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Some find the answer in second couple home, some can. That's one answer. Or going to senior clubs, or if they can.
Yes. No, I think that is. It's just sometimes harder, especially when people are isolated at an older age. It's less easy for them to form new circles.
That's right.
Yeah.
Someone did ask a technical question about the slides, if they might be available for distribution afterwards.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
If they send me an email, I'd be happy to send it along to them.
Thank you.
Okay. Guess that brings us to the end of our time.
I realize this is the last of a series of sessions. Does it repeat?
Next fall,
Okay.
late September to late March or early April. I haven't set it up yet. If you have a suggestion, I'm all ears.
like a topic?
Yes.
Okay. How about maybe it would be an email?
Sure.
I'm assuming I'll continue to get the emails
Okay.
that I've been getting. So
Sure.
I will be aware of the.
Yes, yes, definitely we'll announce them when they're ready. Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Marcus. That was wonderful.